It's time to talk music, audio gear, and anything else that crosses our minds. I'm Mark.
And I'm Peter.
And welcome to the Hurton Audio Podcast. So we're going to do something that we haven't actually done on this podcast since we started it, and we're going to talk about ourselves. So we have had an interesting release process with our new single, Icebox, by Yesterday 95. And what we've done is we've done a lot of, obviously, writing, mixing, mastering, but what we've done is we've sent this to be mastered at Metropolis to see the difference, really.
And I think it's been a very educational process because we would normally, and this is going to get right into the production talk for everybody who is a producer listening, we would normally master our own tracks. And why master your own tracks? Well, number one, you don't have to pay a lot of money because you can do it yourself. And number two, with modern software, you've got all the tools to master your tracks, or so you would think. And, theoretically, you can master your tracks, but what we found when we saw, or we heard what Metropolis could do, and their engineers, we got Andrew Hippy Baldwin when we did the online mastering, which was a really, really good sort of service. I really enjoyed it overall, and it wasn't super expensive or anything, it wasn't like crazy, and it was very fast turnaround. But what he was able to do to our song was that age-old thing that everybody says is the reason why you shouldn't master your own music. He was sat in a, theoretically a perfect or great sounding room. So when we got our mix back, or our master back, it wasn't so much the way that he'd processed the dynamics that had actually caught us out, because, the volume was somewhat to the tune of -8 lufs or around there, which is, perfect for uploading to streaming services and everything. But the overall EQ and where, we was convinced that it'd turned the sides up or done some stuff with the sides of the mix to bring out certain elements like the backing vocals, because it's, for the sort of music we make, this is more of a narrow sounding song, I feel like.
Yeah.
Because it's more to the point rock music. So what he'd done is he'd really, really nailed the EQ on the song, which, I know it sounds silly. I know most people who master music will be like, well, I always nail the EQ. Well, you may nail the EQ in your room or in your headphones or the places where you can find it, but maybe you haven't nailed it everywhere. When we did our playtesting thing, we found our masters, we had not nailed the EQ, but the EQ was great in every room, and the sort of body and warmth and everything was great in every room, whereas ours sounded good in our main studio, but didn't sound that fantastic in some of the other playback scenarios.
Yeah, and some of the songs was a lot closer to what he had done, and some of the songs was a lot further away. And also what this gave us is like a bench post to sort of say, a benchmark, sorry, to say, this is what we are looking for, and, this is a decision that has been made by somebody who knows what they're doing, that we can sort of look at and go, well, we just need to get as close as we can to this.
And that was the other thing as well. We could no longer touch the mix. We could no longer touch that master. That song was set in stone, which when a lot of people, they talk about their music making and the procrastination side and they're doing edits forever. Well, if you pay somebody to do a mix or master, you've invested that money into that mix or master. You're not, once you've got your single revision or whatever that service offers, you are not going to be saying, well, I want to go in there and tweak that snare. You can't. It's done. Somebody else has done it and you've paid for it. Unless you want to undo your payment for this mix or master, you are stuck with that mix or master. And that, when you are finalizing 10 songs in an album like we were, that was the best thing. We was like, Icebox is finished and we can't touch it. What we've got to do is we've got to get the rest of the songs to sound at least as good as Icebox. And that made the full process a lot easier.
And also in this scenario, what it gives you is it gives you a taste of what your songs could sound like in this professional capacity. But obviously a lot of people don't have a lot of money to throw around. You can't throw a couple of grand at mix engineers like Chris Lord-Alge and then do this if you're not like a big band. So what's nice about doing it for one song is it gives you, if you're somebody who typically does everything yourself, it gives you an expectation and some sort of goal to reach. And then you can think, right, well, let me just keep revising the other songs and changing the EQ and changing the balance of the instruments until every song kind of feels like this, in like a blind test to somebody who's not aware of what mastering is and not aware of these subtleties. And that's sort of the goal, is to make it like a just noticeable difference.
And also, it gives you a good idea on what you're doing right. Like, we listened back to the master, we went, well, the volume that we had set is in the right place.
Yeah, so that's the other thing, is it was like a confidence booster. For everything we got right, it was like, yes, well, we clearly know what we're trying to do. We clearly know how we're going about doing this. And then it was, so why did he do the things that we wouldn't have normally done, and what was there? And then it was just trying to think, right, well, how can we go about doing that on the other 9 songs? Which, mastering is a case-by-case basis. And what Icebox had is it had a very catchy chorus with a very distinct backing vocal sort of coming in to lift the song up. So that's not something you can necessarily do on the other songs, because the other songs might not have that backing vocal moment on the chorus. So you have to take what they've done with a pinch of salt when you're looking at it, because obviously you can't recreate everything they've done, because some of it is about the song. And like they say on Mix with the Masters, if the song isn't there, it's tough,
Yeah, and it was very intimidating to actually send the mix in. We was listening to the mix that we'd done, thinking, if we mess up this mix, it is going to mess up our master, and we won't be able to go back. So we really, really did mull over the mix, and we made some quite interesting decisions. Like, we had the kick and the snare very loud, knowing that it was going to be compressed and limited to a certain degree, even if the transients were just basically chopped off the tops. But, there's nothing worse than listening to your mix back and the kick and snare just disappear into like the sludge. And that's what we was really worried about. So we sent in a mix with quite loud kicks and snares, but that didn't really affect the dynamics. If anything, it just made the kick and snare super, super like punchy in the master, but it didn't, it didn't bring the entire headroom of the mix down, which a lot of people would be like, well, yeah, well, by the time you've chopped all the transient off the kick and snare, you're not going to be able to bring the volume up. But it's like, well, these are professionals, and it shows you how you can do it.
And also the thing is like the style of music we was trying to write with Icebox, we wanted a loud kick and snare. It wouldn't have worked if it had like a very subtle kick and snare, like you hear on some of the 70s rock records, where you can't even really perceive the kick on most speakers. And the snare is quite quiet, relatively. Obviously, we was going for more of a modern mix, where the kick and the snare, a bit like what you could say Coldplay do, where Coldplay have the kick and the snare so loud it's unbelievable, but you really struggle to pick out, like if for anybody who's not paying attention, you struggle to pick out the rest of the drums in context. It sounds like the kick and the snare drum are right in front of you, and maybe the cymbals are at the other side of the room. That's how it sounds on more modern records. There's a much bigger emphasis on the rhythm, I suppose, of the kick and the snare, and not so much like if you listen to Van Halen, it's all cymbals. That's how you describe it.
Yeah.
We wanted the opposite of that. We wanted it to be kick and snare forward, and the cymbals need to be in the mix where you would expect them with the guitars and stuff, but they don't need to be, thrashing the listener, because, cymbals can, and there's a few albums I've listened to where cymbals are really like a deal breaker in the mix.
Yeah. And also, like, one of the most important things, vocal level, especially if you are sort of mixing your own music. People like Jimi Hendrix are famously quoted on just trying to bury his vocals in the mix, because he didn't really like his voice very much. And then the engineers would be like, well, you got to be right at the top of the mix, because that's what people are listening for. And he'd be like, well, people listen for my guitar playing. It's like, yeah, they do. But, if you're singing in a song, people need to hear the words. And so it's very difficult, because you've got to, in like, when you factor in mastering, if you put the vocals just above the music bed in your mix, and then you send a stereo file, all the music is going to come up in that master, which means that your vocals are going to get quieter and quieter and quieter, and in some cases they can just get completely lost in the mix.
And we was watching Mix with the Masters, and they was doing some very interesting things where they had this example of the vocals a bit too quiet or a bit too loud, and the mastering engineers had very interesting ways of bringing just the vocal up within the context of a stereo file, which blew my mind, because I didn't think you'd be able to have that much control. But obviously the tools they have and the knowledge they have at doing this particular thing in this environment, they don't have the luxury of being able to just turn the vocal up or down, so they have to have creative workarounds. And that's the sort of thing that's interesting, because just because you've sent a stereo WAV in doesn't mean they can't turn something up. And that's what was interesting with the way Andy Baldwin was turning the sides up to accentuate like the backing vocals on the chorus. Now, for all we know, he's automated the sides up and down. We don't actually know what he's done.
We could
places.
only take a rough guess, and it was very difficult to attain what he did. And we wasn't necessarily trying to clone it, but we was just trying to learn from what he had done to the song. And we thought pretty early on that it'd maybe be ran through tape or a tape simulator, because when we tried that in Ozone, it sort of sounded right. Because what we did, basically, we took our mix then and tried to master it the same as the one we got from Metropolis, where we got close, but it wasn't perfect by any means.
It wasn't a one-to-one. We got as close as we could in volume and frequency, but it's like we said, the automation, maybe the way they've gone about doing things is what you can't recreate. It's very difficult to do something the same, even with the same gear sometimes, because you say, in a lot of studios, even if you have the same gear, it's very difficult to get the same sound, because it's all dependent on what the gear's doing, how old it is. Some of it's like, well, these transformers were from the 70s and you've got a brand new one, so it's therefore it is different. And that's the thing that's very difficult to describe with like the technical production.
Also, it's just knowing how to use it. We was using Shadow Hill's mastering compressor, the one on Brainworks, for a lot of these masters, which we've never really used properly before, or we definitely haven't tried using that well properly. And that was a learning curve in itself, because I was trying to Google what people actually do with it, because it's very intimidating looking, and it's not to be used the same as like a 1176 or like a LA28. It's not the same type of compressor as them. People are actually complaining about how transparent and subtle it is. But again, you're mastering. You want transparency and subtlety. It doesn't matter how hard you're compressing. You don't want to hear that pumping in a master. You want to hear it bringing everything up in volume and squishing the transients down slightly, but in a way that you almost wouldn't even notice.
Yeah. And it's like you say, it's hard to explain mastering to people who aren't really aware of what the process is, because the process has changed over time. It used to just be the mastering engineer got the mix off the analog mixing desk and made it work for vinyl or CD, which is much more of a process. Whereas now, mastering's like the finishing touches on a mix, really, digitally, because you can just take any file and just put it online now. So you don't really need to have like a vehicle like a vinyl or a CD if you're only releasing it to Spotify.
Because something that a lot of people don't know is that vinyl, if you put too much bass or treble in a vinyl, for example, the needle just flies off it. If you have too deep of a sub hit, the groove is so big that the momentum, I believe, that's carried out from the needle will just lift the needle off, and it will either jump or just completely miss the vinyl when it lands, which is why they had these mastering places in the first place. Because, you're mass pressing vinyl, well, everybody's going to send it back if the needle flies off every time they listen to the
and also
song.
This is why music that was released on vinyl in the 60s, 70s and like 80s, I suppose, it's not as bassy as new music, because it couldn't be. It wasn't allowed to be that bassy. So this is very interesting with like the re-emergence of vinyl, because some of the tracks, like on Madian's vinyl that I've got, is very bassy, and I go, how is it very bassy?
Well, there's an easy way to do that. Turn the entire track down.
So you have to turn it up more on your volume,
so
that you have.
on your amplifier, you just got to crank it. That's one way to do it, I would have thought. And another way will be, roll-offs and stuff.
It's subtle things, isn't it, that carve it out.
In the original, analog studios, they probably didn't care that much if things under 30 hertz were actually in the track. I know they'll have had, high-pass filters, but I could see a lot of records being done where people, on the mix aren't that bothered about cutting anything under 30 hertz.
Because they'll have been lucky to get that in some of the recordings, like recording bass players and drummers. They'd be lucky to get subs like that coming off microphones at times, because when you listen to, there's a reason we have so many sub harmonic synthesizers and reinforcements when you're mixing, because it's very difficult to get the punch
off a microphone.
You're like, when you're looking at a traditional drum kit, and these are all things that people want to have when they listen to their tracks, but they're not necessarily things that happen in the room sometimes, like people want them.
Yeah. And Icebox was the last track we actually recorded for this new project, but it came together so well that it's become the first track we wanted to put out, which was interesting in itself, because, albums, if you're making a musical project, or an album or an EP, you will have favourite songs as the composer, and then favourite songs just keep shifting, and maybe one song's been a lot more difficult than another. And a lot of the time, as they always say on things like Mixed with the Masters and classic albums, they will say the song that was the easiest to make is often the best one, or the one that ends up becoming the hit single, because, if it's easy for a reason normally.
And Icebox didn't really fight us at any point, and it came together very, very fast, and there was no issues recording it. And these are the things that make it an ideal song to send off first, because we was confident that there was no issues with it. Whereas there's other songs where you go, well, maybe this didn't go right when we was tracking drums, or maybe we had to re-record the guitars because initially it wasn't what we wanted from the sound, or these are the things that almost put you off your own tracks, because you go, well, is this the best thing we could send? And like you say, with something like Metropolis, you have a sort of deadline, and somebody who's not you to listen, somebody where you can't explain to them in the room, well, when we was recording, this happened and that happened. It's just they've got a WAV, and that's all they have, and they have that and a little bit of a note from you that just says however you want them to do it. You can't be going, well, we had this issue when we was recording, and we had that issue, so could you please fix that? And please, they're not there to fix anything. They're there to bring the track.
It does actually say in the small print on the Metropolis thing, they don't actually, on the service we use, do the spot de-essing and stuff like that, which we saw on the Mix with the Masters Sterling Sound stuff, because that will be reserved for when you're actually doing a full, massive, big budget, sort of label-based project, really. But it's just fantastic that you can actually go, anybody can go to Metropolis Online Mastering and get it done by the same people who are doing these massive, massive industry acts. But you've got to be confident when you go in there, because you're like, well, if you send in something that's, too bass boosted and recorded badly and sort of low fidelity, or you can actually send them something at the right lufs, because we had to then bring the mix down in terms of lufs and send them at the exact right sort of, metering in order for them to do their process properly.
And also, if you're a band, say you're a band member, and you're not doing any of this technical stuff, you're either having to pay the engineer you're working with to do all this stuff to get it mastered, or you're having to hope that the other guy in the band who's doing it is doing it right.
Or that you have maybe a manager, because it felt like to me like this is the sort of thing where a manager or producer would step in to do this stuff and actually pick Metropolis as a mastering studio. And it made me very curious to hear what it would sound like. You see these YouTube thumbnails a lot where people are like, I sent my mix to 4 mixing engineers and the results were unbelievable, blah, 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 at different price points.
Yeah.
Because it does make me wonder, after doing this, what would it sound like if you went for a more low budget, mastering service? And, that's the question. We went for essentially the top of the sort of the cream of the crop regarding mastering. You know, we didn't go for like just some dude who does it, or some person who's like set up and they can do it and they get, you know, like 90% there. A bit like what we do when we master our own music. You know, we get there, we get where it needs to be, but is it the best it could be? Probably not, you know, because there's always going to be limitations, you know, but these are people where that's their 9 to 5. Their 9 to 5 is mastering like as many tracks as they master in a day. And that's all they do. So, and, you know, and they're in the ideal space. And that's what you pay for when you pick something like Metropolis.
Yeah, and that's also like the level of quality and the level of practice that a lot of people who make their own music just don't have, because when you're doing everything yourself, you're doing everything yourself because you don't have the luxury of being able to send every single thing off to different people, you know. Sometimes it's very envious to look at some of the sort of bigger acts and think, well, all they do is the fun bit.
Yeah.
They just go in, sing some stuff, play a piano, and then they say, everybody else sort it out, I'll be back when it's done.
Yeah, somebody comes in there and fixes it all, then somebody mixes it all, then it gets, you know, polished and the creative mix, and then it gets mastered, and boom, it sounds unbelievable. And it should do for that processing chain of people, especially like if you hear people like Chris Lord Alge be like, well, I have a guy that comes in and corrects everything before the mix gets to me in my mix, you know, pricing. So he just literally throws up the faders and he starts having fun. He's like, well, where do I want a delay throw and what do I want the EQ to be and stuff like that. He's not fixing anything, you know, whereas when you record your own music, 99% of the time you will be sat there either tweaking your snare sound if you like making dance music or you're that way inclined, or you will be, if you are more of a rock orientated or performance orientated producer, you will be agonizing over these parts that you've either played or sang. And that's what really, I think, wears people down when they're making their own music and they're trying to mix it and finish it.
It's also not very fun if you're going to mix a track and everybody looks at you in the band and says, that drum fill's not going to cut it. You know, that solo's not going to cut it. That rhythm guitar is all scratchy. Do it again.
Yeah.
And then this is what makes recording so difficult for a lot of people, and this is why you have a lot of bands where, say, the rhythm guitarist and the bassist just go, I'm not recording, you do it. Guy who wants it perfect. Do you know what I mean? And that's a very, very common case. You see, even with some bigger bands, like there's metal bands, I can't remember which ones, where the guitarists just do all the rhythms, leads and bass, and the two other people in the band just play live. Because, you know, if you have a perfectionist in, people get fed up of arguing with them when they're doing an album over years, and that's what happens. Or you have like drummers are just, you know, shafted as far as recording goes, because a lot of drummers get told, well, if it's not on the grid, we'll just move it, you know, or we can just program it, just don't even bother coming in. You know, that's what happens in a lot of the heavier genres, is they just go, we'll just play it on Easy Drummer, so don't bother, you know.
Yeah, or we'll do all the kicks. We'll just trigger all the kicks so you can just worry about hitting the hi-hat and the snare in like a metal genre and stuff. That happens a lot too.
I think vocals and singing is what really gets tough with recording, because for a lot of, like, say, you're looking at like local bands or like unsigned bands just trying to have fun, make the record they want. You know, it's so easy with the tools to just say, drummer and singer, you don't have a clue what you're meant to be doing, so we're just going to correct the singer everywhere we need to, so it's barely even what they sang. And then the drummer, they can record them in the room. As the drummer walks out, just go, oh, we're not using any of that.
Or they can just
sample each drum and put it on MIDI triggers or whatever. It's so easy.
Or they can move it all and snap it to a grid with, like, in Pro Tools. It's very good. And I think all the DAWs now do this, where you literally can just snap all 8 mics and just get all the kicks and snares on the beat, so it sounds theoretically perfect, but still like they sort of played it. But a lot of the time as well, though, drum triggers and snare replacement and stuff is a thing. So normally it's not what you played, it's not your drums. It's, and then you think, as you say, Matt, well, if it's not going to be what I played and it's not going to be
the sound of the
drums, what's the point in me playing it? I might as well use Easy Drummer or something like that. That's the thoughts. And I think that's where you hear these stories of bands going into the studio. Even bands like Coldplay say this in their documentary, where they go into the studio and the band almost breaks up because it's so horrible to a band that's, you know, they're in a room having fun, maybe playing some gigs, and they're just like, wow, we rock, we're awesome. And they go in the studio and there's a guy sat there who's like, yeah, you can't play. yeah, you can't sing, yeah, you can't tune your stuff, your pedals are crap and stuff like that, and all of a sudden they're going to record this dream of their album or debut EP, and they're just being criticised almost non-stop, and that's where a lot of it sort of gets too hard for some of these bands where, you know, if you haven't gone through that already, you know, the first time you go through that, it's like, oh my God, am I even good enough to like play in this band? Especially if it's your band with like your school friends, and especially if 3 people are doing all right and there's one, like, this is the thing that they say with Will Champion in Coldplay. He was like the furthest behind and he almost got kicked out of Coldplay.
I believe one of the producers did kick him out and he quit, and then they had to try and get him back as well.
Because, you know, it's so intimidating, and you know, all the egos get inflated because they're in the studio, and all of a sudden, you know, it's not this dream of recording their record. It's like a nightmare. And there's so many, if you look for them, sort of documentaries where they describe like where they go into the studio and they almost never come out because it just all goes wrong perpetually for the band and the engineers.
And what I will say is, like, as a drummer, recording drums is far from being fun a lot of the time. You are laser focused on the click track a lot of the time. I'm looking forward to maybe recording a little bit less without clicks, because I've always traditionally recorded with clicks. But when you're doing a project like a lot of bands are, and you've got an engineer who's like, we've got to record to a click because then I can fix everything, you know, because that's why you record to a click, is if there's a mess up for everybody, you've got the time. That means you can like swap a bar, or you can do this, you can can
do a radio
chop
edit.
Something out. You can do a radio edit. You can't do these things when you don't record to a click. It's a lot more difficult to correct something when the entire band is going 110 BPM on one section and 90 on the other, which happens so much. It sounds like such a big difference, but that is what happens to bands, particularly if you change from normal time to double or half time. Then the tempo goes wildly out in a lot of like jams and stuff.
It might be like the band naturally jump up 75%, which is a huge difference, but not one that scales to the grid.
And like that's what they said to Nirvana on classic albums, is it was saying, you know, like you speed up on lithium.
Yeah.
You know, Dave, you keep speeding up on lithium. He's like, I don't think I'm speeding up. He's like, but Dave, you are, you know, and it's not fun. Even what people look up to as the best drummers in the world, they all have to fight these battles in the studio, and a lot of people don't realise just how awful it is, and like you say, how deflating it is when you've had to record something and you think it's great, and then somebody comes in. I can't imagine how tough it is on like the major labels for some of the drummers.
It's like the famously like Bob Rock and Metallica. Bob Rock was just like, you rubbish.
Or Tom Petty's drummer with Jimmy Iovine was just constantly bickering all the time, you know, and that's not fun for any band in any studio. What did they say? They did Refugee 50 times.
Yeah, something like that.
But because they was recording live, they wanted the entire band to get it in one go, which is like ridiculous, isn't it, on Refugee?
And I think on the Oasis documentary Supersonic, they also say that they kicked their drummer out because they were sat there saying, we spend 99% of the record doing drums, and then everybody else comes in and does everything else like really quickly. So their solution to that was just to lose the drummer.
Yeah, so it's tough. It's tough playing drums in this sort of recording capacity, because I think recording instruments is not like playing them live, and that's the dilemma you have. Now, what me and Peter have when we're doing music is, because we do everything ourselves, we get to choose what we want to do. So I'm very like anti-correction. So I've had to get really good at playing to a click when playing drums.
And Icebox as a whole, it's not a live recording, but it's made and played live. So it's like it's supposed to sound live, and it's supposed to have that energy and that, you know, that subtle sort of movement of things. You know, nothing is snapped to the grid, and even the keyboards are played live on Icebox. So, you know, you're looking at something where there's been no auto-tune and no quantizing, and that's just what we can do. You know, whether you like it or not is a different thing, but at least it's authentic for us. And that's the thing. I think if you're making music and recording it yourself, you've got to think, how do we want this to sound? You know, what is authentic for us? You know, are we a band that's going to sequence half the music? You know, because you can, and it'll be a lot easier and probably funner if you don't care. Like a band like Depeche Mode found out the hard way in like the 80s or early 90s when they were sat there trying to play these electronic songs by hand, and a producer came in and said, well, you could just sequence that with MIDI, and it was all like, well, isn't that cheating?
Well, yeah, because at what point are they doing anything? I mean, I was almost floored when I read on one of the Sound on Sound articles that the drums for some of the singles on Eliminator was just a drum machine, and then Frank Beard just played the cymbals over it, which when you listen to it, it's almost painfully obvious now.
And this is ZZ Top.
This is ZZ Top, yeah. But when you're growing up, you just assume that all your favourite musicians are playing every single note. And like say on the new version of The Miracle, there is a version of Breakthrough that has drums and real bass.
Real drums and real bass, which heavily implies, and you listen, you go, oh crap, nobody played the drums and bass on Breakthrough. And that blew my mind as well.
Because you just convince yourself, oh, they'll have triggered it. Oh, they'll have just had really cool, really different like technology that makes it sound that way. And then you realise, well, with the primitive technology they did have in the 80s, it was just easier for them to use a drum machine. And it was easier for them to, even if there was adding fills and playing bits, the core of the track, just being able to do the kick and the snare off a drum machine, kick, snare and hi-hat some of the time, is just easier. The only thing is with drum machines is they don't have very good sounding cymbals. So that's why you often hear the cymbals, and then if you hear the cymbals as a listener, you go, well, I can hear him playing the cymbals, so he must be playing all of it.
Yeah. So let us know what you struggle with, and if you are making your own albums, did you find anything we said like relatable or useful, or do you have a completely different process?
Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next week.